morning. I hope when folks trickle in, can have this talk officially started. So my talk today will be about trends in the labor market. We're going to start from national views and zoom in onto taxes and then onto local markets. Let's see. Okay. So the purpose of my talk today is mainly to set the stage for our first panel and to highlight the importance of their analysis. So before I start, I have to say that, and I really have to say, the views expressed here are my own and do not necessarily reflect official positions of the Federal Reserve System. And this will not be the only time you see this today. Okay, so we are already a few years after the onset of the pandemic, and the labor market is still witnessing a lot of shortages. So how can we understand these shortages? They look quite different within different subgroups of the population. And today I'll introduce 3 angles to analyze this labor force shortage and hopefully help everyone understand a little bit more about the current labor force. These factors are age, geography, and inflation. So first, let's start with age. The national labor force participation rate is still 1 percentage point lower than pre-pandemic levels. But if you look at the same statistic by age group, and that's the tiny graph over there on the top, there's a reason I'm making it smaller, is because that's only highlighting the innate differences across age groups on how much they participate in the labor force. But if I take all those 4 lines for 4 different age groups and pinch them right around January 2017, then you get the bigger graph over there. I'm not rescaling or anything, just pinching them together. And then you can see that pre-pandemic, that's before that big spike there, the 4 groups performed pretty similarly. And then afterwards, the 4 groups diverted. On the very top there, you have the 16 to 19-year-olds who have far exceeded their pre-pandemic level labor force participation. And that's the group that you might want them to benefit more from staying in their education and gain more human capital. And the second group there is the primary age labor force, 25 to 54-year-olds, and that's also catching up to their pre-pandemic levels. Third group there is the 20 to 24-year-olds. They are the increasingly disconnected young adults. There's actually going to be an upcoming publication from the Federal Reserve on this group looking at the past 20 years of how this group are becoming more and more disconnected from both education and work. And that's been exacerbated by the pandemic. Last, and definitely not the least, is the 55 and older group highlighted in red there. They are not seeing much of a recovery since the pandemic, and you're going to hear a lot more about this group in our panel discussion later. So which group do we emphasize in terms of motivating back to the labor force is going to be an important policy question. Now, looking at geographic differences, Texas has always been a more lively labor force than the national average. So you can see the labor force participation being higher than the national average over time. And we also recovered faster than the national average, almost at the pre-pandemic level. But we're seeing a tiny bit of contraction recently. And if you zoom in on major metros in Texas, and this is unemployment rate, so being higher means more unemployment, you can see that Houston hovers above Texas average levels in terms of unemployment, whereas Dallas, DFW, and Arlington, and Austin always had lower unemployment rate compared to Texas average. And if we look closer at each county within the MSAs, And I know there's a million lines here, so I'm not asking you to look at every single one of them, but just to focus on the relative position of the dark black line versus all the colorful lines that represents each county. On the very first graph there, you have Dallas, and you can see that the black line kind of mix on the top portion of those colored lines, which means that most counties are kind of doing better than the Texas average. But Dallas was able to advance that gap or advance that advantage post-pandemic, now being completely below that black line. Austin overall has always done better than the Texas average, and there's a little bit of a gap between all the counties and that black line. Houston has a very different story. That's the bottom graph there. And many counties hover above the black line, which means they have higher unemployment rate. And there's a much wider variation as well, highlighting the rural counties doing a lot worse. So, no matter what state, MSA, or county you live in, that also influences your experience of the labor force recovery. Moving on to the third and final factor, which is inflation. It's really not a proper Fed talk without talking about inflation. But I'm trying to convince you that the inflation experience is not nationwide. It's actually quite individualized. If you look at average numbers to begin with, on the top there you have hourly earnings in nominal terms, and that has been growing since the start of the pandemic. Very top line is Austin, and then the very smooth line there is the national average. With more data, it's just smoother. And then the bottom line there is Texas average. Now you can clearly see that the advantage of Austin compared to the national average have closed since the start of the pandemic. And compared to the bottom graph, which is the real wage, those are deflated using headline CPI, you can see that wage is actually declining for all groups. And the experience is really different across different income groups too. Coming back to the growing nominal wage, it's the lower income folks actually experienced a higher nominal income wage growth in terms of percentages. But I'm definitely not saying that the lower income groups have an easy experience during the pandemic, because a lot more of their income is being spent on goods that experience high inflation. Rent, for example, has skyrocketed since the start of the pandemic. On the very top there, you see Austin, leading national numbers and Dallas numbers and throwing Houston in a rearview mirror, really. And that's also a percentage increase that's built on an already high rent price in Austin. So if you look at geographic differences, that will shape your inflation, personal inflation. But not only that, who you are, how you are educated, what industry you're in, also changes your personal experience of inflation. Take early care and education workers, for example. Not only do they experience lower wages, they also were exposed to higher inflation. This is a tool that all of you can explore on the Atlanta Fed website called MyCPI. I put in the information of a typical early care and education teacher. I assume that they have one child and is under 35-year-old, had an associate or a college degree, and if I change that to high school degree, it's gonna become even worse. So they have 7.4 rather than 6.4, which is 1 percentage point higher inflation than the average American. And if you look at the trend below, historically, their personal inflation has been higher than the national average, especially when inflations are high. So, if you imagine an early care and education worker here in Austin, they're really under triple threat here. Their wages are not growing that much, they're under high inflation in terms of rents and local goods, and they have a high personal inflation just because of who they are. So you're going to hear more about this group later in the panel too, because they're a very important group that we want to focus on. All right, I hope that in this short few minutes, I have convinced you that age, geography, and inflation are all very important factors to understand the current labor force. And thank you very much.